2015. In Zambia, it was even more dramatic and fell by a massive 80 percentage points. I think we all on this panel understand the ramifications of this continued challenge for many children across the world to actually have access to education. This has generational implications potentially. This type of new data is vital to help us all design better targeted responses that will help to lift people out of poverty and build forward better from this devastating pandemic. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in many ways, the MPI data is a global positioning system that can help navigate towards a better future for the 1.3 billion people living today in multidimensional poverty. In doing so, it will also help to get the Sustainable Development Goals back on track. Today's report, together with the national reports that will follow in countries like India, provide a detailed picture of where we were when the pandemic struck. And that is vital to understand because it has also defined in so many ways what happened to people subsequently during the pandemic. But it also offers hope and insights for tomorrow, showing how and how much progress was made in the fight against poverty in the years BC or before COVID. I'm delighted to be joined by such a distinguished group of panelists from across the world to discuss the new data and how it can help the development community to generate even better results for the people that together we serve. And I'm very grateful that Mamta, with the World Bank and with whom we work so closely, is also joining us today, alongside Yolanda, James, Sabina, and our own very own chief statistician, Yanchun Zhang. So with these opening remarks, Anjali, back to you.
Thank you so much, Akim, for setting the scene for us today. And we are going to hear from you again shortly, so please don't go anywhere. And I would now, though, want to hand over to present the key findings of the MPI to Sabina Alkaya, who's the director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, and to Yanchun Zhang from the Human Development Report Office, who is also the chief statistician of UNDP. Sabina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anjali. The 2021 Global Multidimensional Poverty Index report focuses on unmasking disparities by ethnicity, caste, and gender. And in doing so, it exposes structural inequalities that really must be addressed. But it also gives stories of hope. I'd like to begin by commending the team that crafted this report. More than 25 people drawn with as many skill sets. It's a work of creativity and ingenuity, and they have my admiration and gratitude along with that of others. Thank you. The Global Multidimensional Poverty Index measures acute multidimensional poverty this year across 109 countries and 5.9 billion people. It has been released since 2010 and covers 3 dimensions and 10 indicators. You are deprived if anyone in your household is undernourished or if a child has died in the last 5 years. You are deprived if nobody has completed 6 years of schooling in your household, or if a child is not attending school up to the age at which they should complete class 8. You are deprived if you cook with solid fuel, lack adequate sanitation or share it with others, lack safe water or must walk 30 minutes or more to fetch it. If you do not have electricity, if your house is substandard in materials, and if you don't own more than 2 of a set of assets. The global MPI creates a deprivation profile for each person, and he or she is identified as multidimensionally poor if they are deprived in at least 1/3 of the weighted indicators, where weights are equal across dimensions and across indicators within dimensions. For example, consider Nyawala from South Sudan, who fled to Uganda with her granddaughter of 9 years. This is her deprivation profile. She has not completed 6 years of schooling, and her granddaughter is out of school. Like others in their settlement, they cook with firewood. Their latrine is shared with 8 families, and they have to walk more than 30 minutes to fetch water. Their house has a dirt floor, and they have one asset, a cell phone, and they're very proud of that cell phone as well as of their solar electricity. According to the global MPI, Nyawala is multidimensionally poor because she is deprived in more, or at least 1/3. In fact, her deprivation score is 61%. The Multidimensional Poverty Index combines the incidence or percentage of people identified as poor with the intensity or average deprivation score among the poor to give a high resolution picture of poverty. Drawing on the demographic and health surveys, the multiple indicator cluster surveys, and national surveys, for which we are grateful, that came out before the pandemic, we find that of the 5.9 billion people covered, 1.3 billion are poor. And of those 1.3 billion, half are children. 85% live in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, 84% in rural areas. And more than 2/3 live in middle, not low income countries. And among those countries, the incidence of poverty ranges from 0 to 67%. And among their subnational regions, it reaches 90%. When we say multidimensional, we mean it. Of those 1.3 billion people, 1 billion lack clean cooking fuel, 1 billion lack adequate sanitation or good standard housing, 788 million have an undernourished person, at least one at home, and half cannot turn on the light at nightfall. And yet there are good stories, despite this cacophony of deprivations that seem to trap so many. So across 80 countries, housing roughly 5 billion people, 70 experienced a statistically significant reduction in absolute values of MPI during at least one period. Of the 20 that reduced it fastest, 14 were in sub-Saharan Africa and 3 in South Asia. 23 countries reduced every MPI indicator significantly. And in some, the very poorest region made the fastest progress, not being left behind, but catching up in Liberia, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Senegal. But there are also troubling themes. If we consider children, in 24 countries, there was 0 statistically significant reduction in multidimensional poverty during at least one period. And in 38 countries, nearly half of the 88 countries studied, either there was 0 change or children's poverty reduced, but not as fast as adults. And in one, it increased. And so that is a troubling trend because children are being left behind, and that's in nearly half of the countries. But our data are before the pandemic. And so using the high frequency post-pandemic surveys for 45 countries from the World Bank, we overlaid them with the global MPI data. And what we found is that emergency social protection coverage during the pandemic was less prevalent in the poorest countries. The non-wage laborers were particularly prominent in the poorest countries, and children more often were not participating in formal education. So there's a very big need for concern and compassion, as we know at this moment. It's not a time for indifference. I'd like to close my section by focusing on gender. Of those 1.3 billion people who are poor, 2/3 do not have a girl or a woman in their household who has completed 6 years of schooling. That's 836 million people. And 1 in 6 multidimensionally poor people have an educated man in their household, a male, but no educated female at all. So there's a daily experience of disparity. It's these that trouble and that we wish to illuminate. 1/6 of multidimensionally poor people live in households headed by a woman. And in 14 countries, female-headed households are poorer than male. So this year, using a brand new gendered analysis, we unmask disparities within the household and shine a light on women, partly because of the burdens they carry across that cacophony of deprivations, and partly also because they are the most powerful actors for change. I pass over to my colleague, Yang.
Thank you very much, Sabina. Hello, everyone. Thanks for your interest in our 2021 MPI report. Continuing with what Sabina presented, in the report's gender section, we also looked at how multidimensional poverty is correlated with one of the most common forms of violence against women and girls, intimate partner violence. Then this graph shows clearly a positive correlation between the two, which means women and girls living in multidimensionally poor households are at higher risk of intimate partner violence. Over the years, UNDP and OFI have been expanding our MPI analysis using disaggregated data to identify who is catching up and who is being left behind, to review deprivations and disparities that may be hidden in aggregated data. A new disaggregation UNDP and OFI are exploring jointly this year is the MPI estimates by ethnic racial groups in 40 countries where we have data and by caste in India. We know the concept of ethnic group is incredibly varied across countries, and that survey instruments and sampling procedures are usually not sufficiently inclusive, so caution is warranted to interpret these results. But we still decided to research on the topic and share the findings in this year's report because we want to raise the awareness that some ethnic groups are among the most disadvantaged and vulnerable populations globally. And it is important not to leave this group behind when tackling multidimensional poverty. In total, our new study covers 2.4 billion people and 291 ethno-racial groups and 5 caste groups. The UNDP OFI joint estimates reveal that disparities in multidimensional poverty among ethnic groups around the world are quite wide. Within country disparities are also wide, varying from less than 1 percentage point to more than 70 percentage points. Some ethnic groups have a very high percentage of multidimensionally poor population. In the 9 poorest ethnic groups covered in our study, the multidimensional poverty headcount ratio is greater than 90%. Which ethnic groups are poorest and how? Data reveals that ethnic minorities in some East Asia and Pacific countries experienced high levels of multidimensional poverty. In Vietnam, for example, ethnic minorities account for about 14% of the total population, but nearly half of multidimensionally poor population. Data also reveals a similar picture in Laos, PDR, and in Mongolia. Indigenous people are found to be the poorest in 7 of the 11 Latin American countries covered in our study. In one of these 7 countries, Bolivia, indigenous people account for about 44% of total population, but 75% of people living in multidimensional poverty. The incidence of multidimensional poverty, however, varies across indigenous groups in the country, ranging from 10% among the Aymara group to around 20% for the Quechua group and other indigenous groups. Our report also finds that some ethnic groups could share similar MPI values but face different deprivations that make up multidimensional poverty, which calls for differentiated anti-poverty policy actions. For example, the Wolof and the Sarahu, the 2 poorest ethnic groups in Gambia, have roughly the same MPI values, but very different composition of their multidimensional poverty. On this graph, you can see that the Sarahu are more deprived in nutrition, child mortality, school attendance, and cooking field, while the Wolof face higher deprivations in years of schooling and the other 5 standard of living indicators. Castes and tribes are more prevalent line of stratification in India. 5 out of 6 multidimensional poor people live in households whose head is from lower tribes or caste, either from the scheduled tribe or the scheduled caste or other backward class. So in data, the schedule in India, the data shows the scheduled tribe is the poorest group. More than half of them live in multidimensional poverty, followed by 33% of the scheduled caste group and 27% of the other backward class group. Because of time constraint, what Sabina and I present today is only a very small set of results in this year's RICH report. So we really encourage you to read our full report as well as to check out our online resources, which include detailed methodology notes, additional MPI data tables, statistical programs, and country profiles. Thanks very much for your attention. Look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Sabina and Yanshan, for that presentation. Very enlightening. It's obvious that so much work from both of your teams goes into producing the MPI, which has such rich data. And as you say, this is just a snapshot that you've been able to give us. A reminder to everyone joining us that it's really wonderful to see people from all over the world joining today. Hi to everybody. Please post your questions in the Q&A tab. We really do want to hear from you. What do you want to know about the MPI? How can the data help you? So we are now going to move into our second section of our event today, our high-level dialogue with our distinguished panel. And first, I want to return to the UNDP administrator to pose some of the questions that will frame our conversation today. Akim, back over to you.
Thank you, Angeline. I'm almost self-conscious because I've not seen as active a chat box as we have here this morning or this afternoon. And so I'll try and get out of the way quickly because I think quite a number of comments and questions have already been posed there. But let me just thank you, thank Yanshan and Sabina again for presenting some of the reports. Let's say, I would even say glimpses of the eye-opening findings that are contained within it. And it is a treasure trove of new data and analysis. And what is obviously particularly interesting this year is that this new information on poverty within ethnic groups and among women points to another phenomenon that I think we need to understand better. One of the tragedies of aggregating, and often the United Nations, or when you take a global perspective, we use data in aggregated format and we lose really the, as you describe it, Sabina, the very real face that only a human being can experience and describe individually of what poverty or multidimensional poverty translates into. But in order to be able to design policies, responses, programs, and do so more intelligently, it's precisely this kind of disaggregation and then drilling deeper that we need. And remarkably, the report shows that disparities within certain ethnic groups are sometimes much greater than disparities across more than 1,200 subnational regions covered by the global MPI. In Chad, just to take one example, across the whole country, some 84% of people live in multidimensional poverty. However, the incidence varies considerably among ethnic groups. Multidimensional poverty among the Mundang ethnic group is 66%, yet among the Tama and Asangori group is 95%. In each of the 9 poorest ethnic groups for which we have data, all in Burkina Faso and Chad, more than 90% of people in these 9 groups are trapped in multidimensional poverty. Or look to the fact that indigenous peoples are among the poorest populations in all of Latin America and the Caribbean countries covered. In Bolivia, for instance, indigenous communities account for approximately 44% of the population, but 75% of multidimensionally poor people. And the report also sheds light on poverty among women. 2/3 of multidimensional poor people across the world, some 836 million people, live in households in which no girl or woman has completed at least 6 years of schooling. There are also major disparities across regions. The percentage of people living in households in which no girl or woman has completed at least 6 years of schooling ranges from 12.8% in Europe, still significant, and Central Asia, to 70.5% in the Arab states region. These are critical new insights, but data alone are not enough to improve lives and drive progress on the global goals. As UNDP and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, we hope that the 2021 Global MPI will be used widely with these insights. And we invite partners, many of you perhaps online also today, both existing and new ones, to use the report, the data, and new tools to help design new interventions, wiser and smarter and better informed interventions that will improve the daily lives of millions of people around the world who live under the constant scourge and threat of poverty. Yet we're also keenly aware that we live in an era of information overload. Therefore, I would like to turn now to our distinguished panelists and to those joining us today to reflect on a number of questions related to how we can turn this data into action. First, might this information lead you to think and act differently? Sometimes things start really with ourselves, as wise we may consider ourselves or well-informed. Second, how might the MPI data inform smarter policies, influence better programs, or generate more impactful research? And this final question is particularly a resonance with us. How can the authors of this report make this analysis, or the way we present it year after year, more useful to you as a development practitioner, as an advocate, as an activist, or simply as somebody who cares about the phenomenon of poverty in our midst? We are fortunate to be joined by a panel who are all distinguished experts in our fight to end poverty. And I think, Anjali, the best thing I can do right now is get out of the way, make room for the panelists, and wish you all an extremely insightful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akim. And thanks for those questions. I think you've really highlighted there the value of this research and data for MPI in provoking each of us in our different roles to think what we can do differently. So I now want to turn to our panel and ask each of you a question. And I'm afraid you only have a couple of minutes each to respond. But of course, each of you will be coming back in and there'll be further questions. And we really want to ask as many questions as possible this afternoon. So first, I want to turn to Mamta Murthy, Vice President for Human Development at the World Bank. Mamta, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
And the question that I want to put to you is that the MPI and its use of non-monetary measures of poverty is part of this wider effort to take a more holistic view of development progress. So how can the World Bank move beyond the $1.90 a day poverty line to try to piece together this poverty puzzle? Over to you.
Thank you, Anjali, and it was a great presentation from Sabina, and great to hear Akim's comments. Since I have only 2 minutes, let me say the following. At the World Bank, we recognize that poverty is multidimensional, and we actually use multidimensional indicators. So we don't use only the income poverty measure, which is useful, but has its limitations. To give you an example of the kind of multidimensional poverty measure we use, we have something called the Human Capital Index, which looks at outcomes. It looks at whether children are healthy, whether they go to school, how much they learn, how long they live. So actually it's a measure of how productive somebody who's born today can expect to be during the course of their lifetime, if they experience the health and education deprivations that are standard for them. We also disaggregate this index by gender, by income group, by geography, and so on. And in our programming, we actually attract resources from donors to support improvements in human capital in the countries where this index is the lowest. So that's how our multidimensional measure is reflected in the work that we do. I hope this answers your question, and I'm very happy to come back in again to say some more things.
Thank you so much, Mamta. It absolutely does. Thank you for putting me right on that. And it's really good to see all of those different indicators. And we'll be coming back to you. But now I want to turn to Yolanda Wright, who is the Global Director of Child Poverty, Climate and Urban at Save the Children International. Welcome, Yolanda.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So the question that I want to put to you is, did anything in this report come as a surprise to you? And what are the main messages, do you think, coming from the MPI for Save the Children's work?
Well, thank you. I'm sad to say there weren't any massive surprises in that we already knew that children are disproportionately affected by poverty, but it confirmed that finding that has continued since the age disaggregation was possible a few years ago. But it is a worry to us as Save the Children, because that, as you saw from the presentation, that has continued, and in some countries we're really continuing to see children falling behind. They're not catching up. And as my colleague from the World Bank talked about human capital, we all know that investing in children is actually an incredibly important investment for any country to make. It's, not just from the sort of human capital point of view, but also morally, and we know that childhood is such an important time. So this multidimensional poverty index is really important to us. It picks up some really key indicators about how children's childhoods are going and how that will affect them for the rest of their life. So we know that things like malnutrition in the first 1,000 days can affect a child's long-term life outcomes, education similarly. So I think there's a few key things that I'd want to very quickly pick up on that comes out to me from the data. One is that we're clearly, although we're making some progress, we're clearly not doing well enough for children yet. And I suspect with COVID and the climate crisis, there's going to be even more of a challenge. In fact, last year, Save the Children and UNICEF brought out some estimates of how COVID might increase multidimensional poverty. And we thought that it would go up at least 15% as a result of the economic shocks of COVID. And I suspect, as we saw from the social protection coverage that was really lowest in low and middle income countries, that the social protection measures, though trillions have been spent, may not have reached those children that needed it the most. And we know from the global hunger crisis that many, over 5 million children as we speak, are facing hunger now. The second thing I wanted to pick up was the gender equality points. For children, this again is really critical. And there's a couple of ones I wanted to pull out. One is how important education of girls is. We see how many of the households that remain in poverty have no women or girls who've completed 6 years of education. And on the flip side, how many of the countries of the families and children not in poverty have someone with that education. So it's a really clear message that we need to unpick here about the protective effect of education on helping children to step out of poverty, and how important it is to ensure that children get a decent start in life and a decent education. And then also the findings about intimate partner violence, again, extremely worrying, because we know that children are extremely affected by violence in the home as well, and it's very correlated with other aspects of poverty. So I just wanted to end very quickly. I know my minutes, I've gone on to 3 minutes, but the last key policy findings for me, policy implementation and implications for me, are that we really need to step up policies that we know work for children, such as child sensitive social protection, child benefits, but also other targeted measures to deal with these inequalities that we see in society, including those that are based on ethnicity, disability, gender. We need to have some universal policies that are inclusive, but also some targeted measures to really kind of make a dent on this continuing problem of child poverty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. And I think what stands out for me so much there is that we are just not doing well enough for children, and as you say, we need to step up. It's and that even more challenges to come, which is a scary thought. So we'll come back on that, but I want to move onto Professor James Foster, who is the Oliver T. Carr Professor of International Affairs and Professor of Economics at George Washington University.
Well, hello, Anjali. Thank you so much for your invitation. Yes.
Hello, Professor. I would like to ask you, seems like a very simple question, but it may not have such a simple answer. In measurement terms, what do you find most interesting about this year's report?
Well, the report's title focuses on unmasking disparities, and methodologically, it uses two measurement techniques to do so. One is the long-standing tool of subgroup decomposability, which this class of measures, and indeed nearly all the metrics I've advocated across the years, satisfies. it's important to know that there's consistency between national poverty estimates and disaggregations by any subnational region, ethnic group, age cohort, gender of the household head, and so on. MPI is disaggregated here by each of these, revealing disparities in a tangible, comparative way. And because the MPI measures the deprivations of each household directly, this gives it precision and insights on disparity that are simply not feasible in other complementary measures like the $1.90 a day, as good as they are for other purposes. So the MPI is a good choice if you want to unmask disparities. The other measurement technique used here is the linked intra-household and gendered analysis that OFI first used to study undernourished and out-of-school children across South Asia. This year, it underlies the findings that 2/3 of the poor lack an educated woman at home, and 1 in 6 lives with an educated, 1 in 6 lives with an educated male, but no female. The basic idea is that for each person, you know their individual data on age, gender, and schooling, as well as their MPI deprivation profile. And you know this for the others in their household too. So after you compute the MPI, you go back and look within the household at the individual and intra-household data and at MPI profiles all at the same time. It's new, it's neat, and I think it will be used a lot. And it creates another powerful layer of insight using existing data, which simply is not possible if we have bubbles of anonymous big data floating about where people can't be linked with one another. I'd like to salute Usha Kanagaratnam and Nikolai Supa of OFI for figuring out how to do this detailed work for 109 countries on top of everything else. It's a massive task that reveals a whole new category of disparities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I really like your use of the word unmask there. I think it's so interesting to think of it in that way, that we have these general indicators, but we can really unmask, go in and interrogate the data. So I would now want to ask Sabina and Yangchun if there's anything that's been said so far that you would like to respond to, come back on. Sabina?
No, I think this has really been very helpful in encapsulating and situating this work. And I think the only question that I would have is that there's one group of actors who are policymakers and people in positions of activity on these issues, but there's also students, there are people studying them, there are people in another area but interested in poverty. And the hope is that what is online as well as in the report is a lot of material, just to say that you can download an easy to read PDF, you can look at the data for your country, do a school project with interactive data banks. But our hope is that it's not just for the, it's also for the younger generation.
And Yangchun, anything that you would like to add?
Yes, very briefly. As Mamita said, $1.90 poverty line estimates and our multidimensional poverty estimates actually are very complementary. Not only us at HDRO, but also countries themselves are tracking both indicators. Then other multidimensional indicators were also developed by different institutions, including World Bank. The Human Capital Index is a very welcome addition. Then our office has been also interacted with World Bank in discussing how the Human Capital Index and our Human Development Index are in common or complement each other. So it's a good development. For more multidimensional indices being developed, I think that multidimensional perspective is really needed, not only in terms of tackling poverty, but also other vulnerabilities. Back to you.
Thank you, Yangchun. So we now want to move to questions from from our audience, from our participants. Thank you so much, everybody, for all your questions coming in. I am going to start with a question for Mamta. We have a question about population aging. What are the implications of an aging population for poverty, and the implications for the work that we have to do to tackle poverty? One for you, Mamta.
Thank you. That's a terrific question. We often end up focusing in these discussions of poverty about countries where there is a very high rate of growth of population, but there are also countries where the rate of growth of population is slowing, and often these countries face challenges. They face the challenge of how to retain growth, economic growth, and growth of productivity. That's extremely important if you want to have the resources for education and healthcare and water and all the other things that are important. These countries also face a situation of needing to care for their elderly, and often the burden of care falls on women. So women are both in the labor force, they're taking care of children, and they're taking care of the elderly. Aging represents a challenge both at the national level and in terms of economic growth. It also represents a challenge at the household level for the purposes of care. So it's an extremely important dimension to take into account. In the Human Capital Index, the way we take it into account is we think about utilization of human capital, and how can utilization be maintained at a high level. I know these sound like very technical and monetary terms, but it's really around how can we continue to provide opportunity for people throughout the life cycle so that they can live a full and meaningful life. And there are a number of measures that we think of both in terms of health, in terms of pensions, in terms of social care, that are extremely important. In terms of active aging and continuing to contribute and participate and benefit from a long life, those are the things that have to be taken into account when thinking of aging.
Thank you so much, Mamta. And I couldn't see you there for a moment, but we got you back, so I'm very glad about that. We have a question here for Yolanda. International organizations put out a lot of reports. I'm sure they can't possibly be referring to the UN. As Akim said, we live in an information overcrowded age. What can we do to make these reports more useful to your work at Save the Children?
Well, I think it's a great start what Sabina said about some of the data behind this index. Apparently, you know, that it's all available in different formats to be used in different ways. I think making information accessible is incredibly important. And one of the things that Save the Children wants to do as a child rights organization is also make information available to children and young people in suitable formats. So quite interestingly,
I think we may have lost Yolanda there for a second.
Sorry.
Yolanda. Oh, hi, you're back.
Hi, sorry.
Yolanda, I think you might be having some problems with the Wi-Fi. We'll come back to you on that, if you can hear me. So let's move on to a question to Sabina. For the Human Development Report, the addition of planetary pressure adjusted methodology gave a nuanced view, taking into consideration the use of resources. How has the global MPI index taken into account the planetary pressures in measuring poverty and exploring planetary pressure minimization policy solutions that could be contextualized at the local level? I feel like that was a bit of a tongue twister, but Sabina, if you want me to repeat the question, let me know.
That's fine. No, thank you so much. It's a brilliant question. So the global MPI can be mapped to existing subnational regions for 1,291 subnational regions. So one option is to overlay a other data in a mapping form and look at where the patterns coincide. But also a number of the surveys have GIS locations for households with appropriate privacy protections. And so these can be merged, whether it is with deforestation data or air pollution data, drought and flooding data, and even nightlight data. So there are different ways of merging data sets to look at both of them in an integrated fashion. So this is at the stage of research, but it's something also that others might be interested in, also are doing actually in different places. So we look forward to bringing it together into one place later on, but it's a good question and a need for our times.
Great, that's good to know. Thank you so much. So another question, this one, Yanshin, I think this would be one for you. What are the lessons learned from COVID for revising the MPI? And given that many people who weren't previously considered poor in the education dimension have now fallen into poverty because they did not have access to online education during COVID. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Anjali. We think it is imperative to include some COVID analysis in this year's report, but the survey data doesn't allow us to do the COVID analysis. So that's why we rely on World Bank's high-frequency phone interview data to write the COVID section in this year's report. As the administrator mentioned, it's still far from the final assessment of the impact of this pandemic on the population, especially those most vulnerable. So what we can see from this year's analysis is, in terms of some developed indicators, for example, loss of access to formal education, we do see a very big drop in formal education activities after COVID, especially in sub-Saharan African countries. But there are also disparities across countries. Some countries perform better than others. So in our report, I feel we present a lot of what, but going forward, we'll probably have to dig deeper to ask ourselves why questions and how questions. I also want to add a little bit to what Sabina mentioned on environmental impacts or planetary pressures versus MPI. In the last year's report, for example, we used the subnational MPI data to look at how the incidence of natural disasters overlay with the sub-regional, subnational MPI data. So that's some efforts we have been doing. But going forward, this is a very important dimension we need to consider how to incorporate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And more questions coming in. So I'm just going to quick fire, but this is for Professor Foster. As a poverty measurement expert, what do you think are the biggest data gaps we need to fill to get a better view of poverty?
Oh, golly, where do I start? I mean, we just heard the most important one right now, which is frequency. I mean, we can afford to go out and get labor market reports every quarter, every week, but we can't somehow make it possible for us to understand the condition of the poor on a more regular basis. So number one, frequency. And we need to do new, clever ways of getting the real short amount of data that are needed for doing a multidimensional poverty index more frequently. There are clever ways of going through cell phones now with the incredible generality of people owning cell phones. We really can keep in touch with what's going on the ground. So this needs to be expanded. I would just point to those two first. There are many others, but I won't monopolize the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to check if Yolanda is back with us.
I am, yes. Hi, sorry about that.
No, of course. I wanted to go back to that question, but also if there was anything else that you wanted to come in on from any of the other questions that have been asked.
I was just wanting to say that absolutely creating information in various different formats is really important. And I think I congratulate UNDP and OFI for doing that for this data set and making the data available to researchers around the world. I also want to just make a plug for child-friendly versions as well, because as you know from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, children have a right to have a stake in their own future. And this issue of, you know, half of all of the multidimensionally poorer children, they're disproportionately represented among those in multidimensional poverty. They should also have a right to see some of this data, and also data about things like the climate crisis, which is going to affect them into the future. So absolutely agree that, you know, creating available, making information available and making it available in easy to digest forms is incredibly important. Thank you.
Thanks, Yolanda. Of course, that's music to my ears as someone who works in communications. So thank you for that. I think, Mamta, we have a question here. Mamta, I think this might be interesting for you to answer. This report, the MPI report, puts a spotlight on ethnicity and inequities. Is there actionable information here for your organization, for the World Bank? And please do come in on any of the other questions if there was something that you wanted to come in on.
Thank you. It's a great question. I have to tell you that many years ago, the World Bank wrote the first report on the deprivation of the Roma minority in Europe. And actually, we were it was a path-breaking report, and I want to link it to this question of data. Sometimes it's very difficult to analyze these issues because there is no information on ethnicity or data or caste at the level of disaggregation that one would want. So I think to look at these issues more closely, it would be very important to make progress on this issue of identification. Often it's self-identification. Because it's hard to do a disaggregation in terms of ethnicity or caste or other dimensions if it isn't possible to get data on these things. So in addition to frequency, I would say that some of these issues really require more information on these particular dimensions of deprivation that we're interested in. I also want to make the point about human capital and productivity. And don't we believe that we should be investing in people because it's a good thing to do? It's morally the right thing to do. Why do we talk about human capital? I think we of course, we should invest in people because it's morally the right thing to do. But we wanted to make sure that ministers of finance, the ones who hold the purse strings, we wanted them to see this investment as an investment and not as recurrent spending, something that they have to give money for, but which doesn't give a return. And that's why we emphasized this concept of human capital and came up with the Human Capital Index. And finally, I think the connection between human capital, poverty, environmental issues is absolutely key. I think it's very important to see people as the solution and a change in behavior of people as a solution to the growing carbon footprint of the world. And equally, we need to recognize the impact of environmental degradation on people. So it's a two-way thing that it's very important for us to invest on, both the role of people as actors and the role of people as victims. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mamta. And more questions coming in, so I'm going to keep rolling with them. A question for Sabina or Yangcheng. For countries that are yet to adopt a national MPI, to what extent does a global MPI and a national MPI make a difference when making policy level decisions? I'm not sure who wants to come in on that.
Thank you so much. It's a very good question. So the global MPI is a common measuring yard which can be used to compare different countries in many different levels of development. And the national MPI is bespoke. It's tailored to the national context, the national data sets, the aspirations and plans and documents about poverty. So they complement each other. In some cases, for example, in Nepal, they coincide. So after various technical exercises exploring different options for their multidimensional poverty measure, the government in Nepal chose to use the global MPI as their official permanent national statistic of multidimensional poverty, whereas others decide to change it to use a different data set and to adjust it so that it better reflects the priorities of the moment. So both are useful, but I think the global MPI information is useful also to socialize and to expose policy actors to what will come out of a national MPI. That was done in Sri Lanka, for example, as well as in other countries. So that people can wrap their mind around what a measure brings and then decide how to tailor it further to their context.
Thank you so much, Sabina. And we have more and more questions coming in, but I am mindful of time, and I do want to come back to everybody for your final thoughts. So I'll come back to each of you, maybe starting with James, with Professor Foster. You have around 30 seconds for your final thoughts.
30 seconds. I want to stress the results from the report that show that educated women are absent from many, many households. And in particular, to stress that this represents not just disparity, but actual loss in capabilities of people. Within the household, the woman is in fact providing external capabilities to so many members in so many ways that you know well. And so consequently, this represents a decrease in the capabilities of all members of that household. Just to remember that this is even more important and tangible than a relative thing.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Mamta, can I go to you for your 30 seconds, your final thoughts?
Thank you, Anjali. I want to say that I think it's fantastic we're talking about multidimensional aspects of poverty, and that we're talking about it during the middle of a pandemic. This pandemic is going to set back human opportunity in a way that we just are beginning to understand, because of the number of children who've been out of school, because of the fact that there's so much preventive care that has been postponed, because so many people are out of employment, so many people haven't got their first jobs. And I haven't even begun talking about the mortality and the morbidity. So I think this is a moment to really focus on making sure that we can, in whatever we do, we can support the building back of this human opportunity that is being lost through the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mamta. And to Yolanda, I hope you're with us.
Yeah, and I would just like to use my time to further emphasize the same points that James and Mamta has said, to be honest. I mean, obviously from Save the Children, I'll point out that, deprivations in childhood are so crucial for the rest of children's lives, but same thing about gender equality. I really believe that the future is educating girls. I mean, one of the best investments you can make in the future is educating girls and helping them to complete as long as education as boys do, and both girls and boys having a good education. And I think that looking at these different dimensions of poverty is so useful. And I hope that this does galvanize even further action to kind of address those multiple dimensions of poverty that can start in childhood and can trap people into long-term poverty. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. And Yang-Chun, just for your kind of sum up final intervention.
Thank you very much, Anjali. Also add a little bit to your last question to Sabina and me. I just want to say UNDP is involved in both global MPI and national MPI work. We are co-author of the global MPI report, but we also, many parts of the UNDP is helping countries in producing their national MPIs. We also work very closely with academic institutions like OFI and GEMS Center, and also working with World Bank and UNICEF in helping countries to track and report SDG target 1.2. So a lot of work is done at UNDP to support multidimensional poverty research and also program work. Then going forward, as I mentioned before, it's not only about the what question, but also the why question and how question. Then it requires more participation from countries themselves and also from young youth, from all citizens interested in eradicating poverty in all forms everywhere. So this is a mission for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yang-Chun. And over to you, Sabina.
Thank you so much. the global community is being rocked by a public health crisis, and it exposed these cracks in the health systems and the social protection systems, but also these structural inequalities in ethnicity, caste, gender that we've tried to illuminate. And yet it's also an opportunity. And there's something that struck me that our late mentor, Sir Tony Atkinson, said in his last book, which is that there's something different about poverty statistics and numbers. And what's different is that they have to be linked to action for them to make any sense at all. And so the hope in doing these studies and releasing these reports is that they will be useful. But what that means in practice, because none of us have been in a pandemic of this kind before, is that each person will have to innovate to be an entrepreneur, whether a business leader or a bureaucrat, to really think in their own context fresh. How can we take these data? How can we do something? And how can we, turn the needle on poverty in a way that's decisive and historic? And I think the creativity and the commitment of many people, first and foremost, the protagonists of poverty themselves, that is what's necessary as a complement to this study. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabina. So unfortunately, I think that brings us to the end of our event. Thank you so much to all of the panel for your expert insights and for sticking to your very unfair time limits. Thank you to everybody joining. Thank you for all of your questions and your engagement. We really encourage you to if you haven't done so already, to read the report, to delve into it, as Akim said earlier, to really see how it can make us all think differently, what we can do differently, and also to give us feedback on how we can improve the MPI, how we can make it more useful to all of your work. So thank you to everybody. Thanks so much for joining. See you soon. Bye.